Hello and welcome to 168 Hours. We continue our collaboration with Global Campus of Human Rights, and today I'm honored to interview Dr. Michael Hayes, Academic Director of APMA Program and member of the Global Campus Council. Dr. Hayes, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
At the end of October, you'll be leading the Global Classroom in Bangkok on business and human rights. Could you share us what the main focus of this event will be?
So the Global Classroom is an event that we have maybe every couple of years now. We bring together students from the 8 regional programs. So how the Global Campus is organized is we have, eight different programs. What's important in terms of human rights research and education and training is just not each region focusing on issues within their own region, but there is some kind of inter-regional connections. So the main focus of this Global Classroom is to looking at how can human rights advocacy be done at the global level. It's a bit of an experiment where students from different regions have to work together looking at an issue around business, human rights and the environment. So the main focus there is a kind of a question, what are the challenges of global level advocacy? Because we tend to be quite good at advocating at the national level, maybe even sometimes at the regional level, but advocating around issues which may cross over into different regions. That's what we're looking at. Because in terms of what's happening now around business and the environment, we do have global level problems. We can't respond to climate change just by looking at one country or one region. We have to look at, how supply chains work, how the environment is protected at, across a range of different regions. So that's the main focus of the Global Classroom.
What should be the role of universities when it comes to protecting and promoting human rights?
Because this is an important question and one that we've been working in for quite a while, because we do tend to forget that universities should be playing a very important role in terms of human rights promotion and protection. There are other obvious things which universities do, and this is like, say, human rights education and teaching people about human rights and making sure human rights is in the curriculum in the classroom. But then on top of that, we do have other issues, say, like doing research on human rights. We better understand what the challenges are in terms of then addressing human rights concerns, and then how to kind of research and understand what's going on in terms of human rights around the world, whether it's a legal issue, a social issue, a philosophical issue, a technology issue, and so on. So universities have a pretty important role there. But what we're also trying to promote is that universities should be playing more a role in kind of monitoring and evaluating and commenting on human rights and that community and society itself. And this means that, this is uncomfortable for some, but that universities should be critical of governments and what they do. Now, particularly in some regions, that's not accepted, but we think that in order for people to ensure that rights are met and that governments are respecting their duty, universities should be able to play a role in kind of giving input into governments and talking about, monitoring what governments are doing. And then the final one is that universities could be playing more of a role in terms of its protection, particularly what's happening in Thailand. We have the conflict next door in Myanmar, and universities, many of them playing quite a good role in terms of protecting people from the conflict on there. This is whether it's refugees or minority groups or persons with a disability, that universities can play a role to assist those communities to protect themselves.
What kind of challenges and difficulties universities face while engaging with human rights topics?
I think this is important because particularly now across the world, we see universities being under attack. We know that there's kind of a rise in authoritarianism going on, more conservative values, and one of their targets has been universities. Now, in some cases, that's because there is a battle over the truth. And of course, universities are sites where they'd like to kind of promote the truth and promote research and to get better understanding. But also because of that, they have then been targeted. The most famous ones we see are what's going on in the United States now with attacks on the famous universities there and the limits that are trying to be made to those universities. But even just in a range of different countries, like coming back to, say, our work around Thailand, is that one of the first places that the Myanmar military were attacking were the universities, and they closed them down because they see these places as kind of sites of opposition. Now, while there may be some grounds in some places saying that universities do tend to be a bit more left-wing and a bit more, revolutionary, that may be the case. But I think closing universities down and stopping those expressions or just making them kind of more conservative institutions is not going to work. So we see that that's kind of important. And this is particularly around ideas, say, with migration, ideas around gender. We know that gender has become particularly sensitive, and even importantly around the environment, to protect the environment as well. In all those areas that universities have a role to play.
How can universities maintain academic freedom and independence while addressing sensitive or politically charged human rights issues?
Because we know that everyone recognizes academic freedom, and most countries understand that there is a kind of a use for academic freedom, and that freedom should be kind of respected. But we're finding that being challenged more and more in a whole different variety of ways. Sometimes it's just around funding, sometimes it's around employment contracts. But this is in terms of kind of gaining and respecting academic freedom, that can be quite a challenge. Now, different universities take different approaches. We're more of the approach that we should respect freedom of expression, and that means that people be able to express ideas, whether they're widely accepted or not, which does mean that there shouldn't be speakers who are closed down because they may have conservative views or wrong views. Now, of course, the challenge there is there are kind of markers about you don't want people openly espousing racism or sexism or kind of intolerable values. But there should be freedom where people kind of can debate about what, say, non-discrimination means.
What's the role of students and also young scholars when it comes to these issues?
And this is a really sensitive one as well, because we know that there's been lots of kind of pushback against the students and student protesters, particularly we see with what's going on in Palestine now. Because we know that one of the limitations of academic freedom is it tends to focus on academics and not students. But just for example, like at the university I teach at now, Mahidol, that just unfortunately today, I was in a class and the students were talking about one of their colleagues, one of their fellow students has been jailed quite recently because of freedom of expression issues in Thailand. And it is kind of like not a great thing when you have students who are being jailed because of views. Students should have the right to freedom of expression, and universities should protect them. So students do play a very important role. Lecturers, of course, have a different role in terms of ensuring that the kind of the space where speech is undertaken and that people that are invited along can kind of respect that, and that we have that there is like peaceful assembly and people talk peacefully about these. And while the debates might be quite heated, there might be quite different views, there still is a peaceful discussion going on and people learn from that discussion.
Should lecturers talk about, I don't know, sensitive human rights topics with students?
Definitely yes, though it is something which lecturers have to kind of be aware of what they're doing in training and how they do that as well. So we know from the region that issues around, say, sexuality and gender identity can be quite sensitive in some countries, and they have to be kind of managed quite carefully. But also, I think importantly, like what some of the most sensitive topics we tend to forget are history, in terms of what's happened in history and how we identify that history. We see that like throughout Southeast Asia, because often there have been some quite big moments in history of uprisings, and which, like I say, in Indonesia, in the mid-1960s, there was a huge pogrom where a couple of 100,000 of people were killed. They still can't talk about that. Much like in Thailand, some of the earlier revolutions in 92 and 97 are not really taught in schools. And so that's a sensitive issue.
What's the role of Global Campus of Human Rights in this situation?
So the Global Campus has a couple of roles. Like the main role is just to make this education available and accessible. So particularly for Asia, there are some good human rights programs, but not that many. But also a lot of students who want to study this don't really have the means and the resources to that. And so we can provide scholarships and then cheap education to study human rights and kind of the infrastructure to support that. Also, like another role that we have found more and more is that the Global Campus then kind of acts to protect students. So we've had students who have been threatened either with jail or with other kinds of other threats. That because the Global Campus is a global network and one taken quite seriously, that means we do have a little bit of a say, a little bit of power to say to governments or to embassies or whatever, you shouldn't really be doing this, or you should be protecting these students more. So it's the kind of the dual role it has.
What kind of partnership between universities, NGOs, and governments could strengthen human rights work?
So it's an important one, and it's one that can be quite difficult. Like it varies in lots of countries, but we see universities are kind of this halfway because many of them are kind of government universities or half, or funded by the government, and they're seen by civil society as parts of the government. And so this can be a challenge that when we've developed programs in some countries, and NGOs say that, you're a university, you're part of the government, you're not really civil society. Whereas universities like to think, no, we're more attached to civil society and the government. So it kind of acts, so it's got a couple of roles. One is it's kind of that bridge between civil society and the government. So it should be like an independent government organization which can both contribute to capacity development and civil society. But also it's there to kind of monitor and comment on what the government is doing. Now, of course, the main one as well is that like most of our graduates tend to go on to work in civil society as well. And so there is that kind of role of the capacity development, supporting civil society and strengthening civil society networks in countries as well. Yeah.
Could you remember some good examples of those kind of cooperations?
So we do, so in a range of countries, with like this is say in Timor and Vietnam and Cambodia, that we've gone into universities and assisted those universities to set up human rights programs. And often the first step there is to kind of link up NGOs with the university. Now the NGOs find that quite useful because often they want to do more kind of high level research, or they want to develop their skills in terms of having more of a policy impact. And so they like the research that comes out of universities, and they can collaborate with researchers or sometimes graduate students to undertake research projects, while at the same time then kind of develop their own skills in terms of whether it's doing research. So, I mean, for example, in Timor, where there's a very good Center of Human Rights at the Timor National University. They have very strong connections with the civil society. And where in Timor, the civil society was quite well developed. The civil society really had a lot of input and helped that university develop a program, which just means that most university students now are more aware about human rights.
Dr. Hayes, looking back, how have you personally seen the role of universities in human rights evolve over the years?
So I've been working in human rights at universities, since the late 90s, so quite a time. And we did a survey, this is kind of around 2010 or so, and this is a very basic survey, just looking at how many students at universities were exposed to human rights in the classroom. And while it was a very basic survey, we can't really take the numbers too seriously. It was something like about, 1 in 500 students were exposed to human rights in the classroom, because human rights were just not seen as a university topic. Now, since then, we've seen a huge explosion in the number of courses, in the number of degrees available. And so in many places that it's kind of expected that students would kind of be exposed to human rights in the classroom. And that's kind of important because it means that, that universities are teaching it and students are learning. But a couple of other things are very important. And the next one, I think, is that students want to study human rights because they see that it's good for their career. And so a number of times the past couple of years, I've had students coming to class saying, I want to do the human rights course because I want to work in the UN or international organizations. And I see human rights as quite important. I think the final one is in terms of human rights, is that human rights is kind of a good added value to the education process itself. One of the challenges that we see in kind of authoritarian countries is that dictatorship doesn't end at the outside. It's kind of like in the classrooms, and there's a lack of democracy, lack of participation in the classrooms. The kind of human rights and democracy sort of in a way starts in the classrooms. You want to democratize that process. And so students are more used to participating, respecting diversity in the classrooms, and then it kind of goes out to society at large. And so I think both those things we've seen that there's been a change from this very old style, very dictatorial teaching to much more participatory teaching. But also you just see that a lot more students are kind of aware of human rights and willing to kind of protect human rights.
Currently, I'm working in Armenia, and here in universities, usually lecturers have different problems while, for instance, criticizing the government's actions, this or that action, and they shouldn't do it in the universities. It's forbidden. While whether they are trying to do it, they are being just fired. Even if they go to a studio and give an interview to a journalist and express their opinion about this or that issue or criticize the government. How do you assess this situation, and have you observed these kind of examples in other countries as well?
So it's definitely an issue in a lot of countries. And that's why, academic freedom is quite important. So at our institute, we host the Southeast Asian Coalition of Academic Freedom. And so it is one of these key areas that needs to be developed. Now, what's kind of a curious thing about this is that human rights itself in most countries, like in Thailand, talking about human rights, it's fine. Like the sensitive topics, as I mentioned before, history is a big one. The environment is another big one, that you've got to be careful about the environment, and also then businesses and talking about business violations. And so those are the ones that lecturers tend to get the most trouble with. Now that varies from country to country. So, as you mentioned in Armenia, that the government just doesn't allow lecturers to kind of comment and give input into government and what government should do. But really, that's just, that shouldn't happen. Of course it does, but really that universities and lecturers should be much more respected and have their freedom of opinion, or their ability to kind of show their research respected, because we know that in terms of those academics, they would have done the research, they would have got the evidence, they kind of know those things. And so it makes sense for them to be able to comment on that in public and to have an open discussion, because that's how communities and how countries get better, by having these kind of discussions and weighing up the evidence and then coming to some participatory outcome from that.
And it is beneficial for the government as well.
And this is the kind of the problem, is that most governments don't look at universities as kind of like being in an opposition, or universities as being a problem to deal with, rather than seeing them being as a benefit for that. Because in a whole range of areas, whether it's around health or education or the environment, universities do have a lot to offer, and they can make assist the government in their decisions.
What are your hopes for the future? Like, how do you see universities shaping the human rights agenda in the next decade?
Well, it's troublesome times right now. We've had a lot of challenges, that we see a lot of conflict going on. What's going on in Ukraine and Palestine. We have the neighboring conflict in Myanmar here. And then we have, the funding being cut as well. And so we know that the USAID was cut, and also this kind of move back to spending on defense over kind of civil society. So there's a whole range of challenges. And so it's not a great time to talk about, how good things are going, because it's more like survival mode. But I do tend to think this is kind of like, it's like a pendulum. It's kind of swinging one way where it's quite difficult, but eventually it will swing back. And this is what I'm kind of hoping, that we see more development around strengthening universities in their role. We see there are more and more universities who are agreeing that they do have a role to play in terms of things like protection, and whether it's migrant workers, refugees, stateless person with a disability, and kind of roles in protecting those rights. And so universities being more kind of activist around that. And also then seeing the role of universities being more kind of productive in society as well. This is speaking from more like developing countries. We look at countries, say like Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar, that there's a real benefit to universities playing a more active role in that country's peaceful development. So hopefully in the future we will see more human rights at university. We will see more universities being active around the promotion and protection of human rights. But maybe not this year, but in a couple of years' time, hopefully.
What kind of advice would you give to students and lecturers in these hard times?
I mean, the main advice I always give to students is just kind of like work hard, do your research, do your reading, use your time at university quite actively. Because I think one of the challenges is that people think that if you've got a good heart, it means you're going to be good at human rights. But it doesn't work like that. You've got to know the stuff, and you've got to know what the rights are and how they work. You want to know the kind of professional skills, whether it's around advocacy or legal advocacy or monitoring and evaluation, on all those things. Like you have to kind of know your stuff to be good at human rights. And so my advice to students is always just study hard and enjoy it, because it will be useful in the future. I think in terms of like lecturers in universities as well, I think that people are kind of scared of human rights because they think it's like not that widely seen, or that's too political or too sensitive. But the majority of human rights is kind of like quite simple stuff, like access to education or food or water or rights to privacy. There's a whole range of issues which are not really that sensitive. which are kind of important to what's happening now. You know, even like the big one now is AI in the classrooms. You know, there are human rights elements to that as well. So in a range of ways, I'd say to lecturers, you know, don't be scared of human rights. You can look at this as being quite useful to what you do. And also another key one is that, you know, if you work with humans, then human rights are relevant. So human rights are not a fringe topic. It's not like everything has to be about human rights, but we've got to think that in the situations that we work when there are humans there, a good basic knowledge of human rights is going to benefit no matter what type of job you have. So that'll be some of my points of advice.
Thank you so much for this insightful interview.
Great. I mean, thank you very much for the invite, and I enjoyed that very much.
Thanks for watching this interview. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.